All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Lawrence Technological University. Part of, I think we'll talk a little bit about the work that you see around you, and we've got a great panel here to discuss some of these things. As a general introduction, Lawrence Tech College of Architecture and Design has degrees in architecture, interiors, graphic design, game design, and product design. And we, as part of our lecture series, we try and bring people that can talk about multiple disciplines. And so we had, it was actually when Julian was here, I think we said 3 months ago, or something like that.
Yeah,
I said a year ago. But we started having this idea about something that we might do for Month of Design in Detroit. And we cooked up this idea about thinking about the future of urban mobility in 2050 as an idea about imagining possibilities and thinking about some of these things. We did, you want to say more?
I'll grab the mic.
We did, as part of this, as part of our pitch for the Month of Design, was an idea about doing an international call for AI images. And so we had been starting to think about AI and image generation as it relates to design and thinking about the future. And we put out a call, and it was as simple as that, which was think about or imagine the future of urban mobility in 2050. And this is probably even more than what we said when we asked people to do that. And maybe disclosing a little bit of some of what happens. You put out an international call and then you wait. And then you start to get nervous that no one's gonna come to your party. And then you wait more. And then, like most designers, the day of the deadline, you get 1,000 submissions. And so it's part of the process. We keep iterating. So the call yielded just over 1,000 images, 1,020 images from 164 different people. I think I'd said something earlier that I thought it was 60 people, but this is what happens with like the deadline on the day of the deadline, and probably even after, a couple of days after the deadline. 164 different people submitted, and I think we'll talk a little bit about seriality and multiple images and those types of things, but what you see is work represented from 22 different countries. So it was truly an international call related to these images. Sarah and I, as curators, took the 1,000 images and compressed it down to, I think, just about 500 images that we see in the room today. And the organization of the show, because some people had submitted multiple images with different themes, the work is not organized by submission or by artist, but instead by color. And so what you see is they start with dark images in the back, and then as it comes around the room, it finishes with lighter images. And so it seems like there's a lot of very dark images, and then it ends with some light images. What else do you want to say? Where did I leave out?
Just the fact that we are having many conversations related to the topic of AI in the college, because we want to keep exploring and understanding these kind of tools. And I know that we have some sophomore students, at least I saw in the room, that hopefully, like, being exposed to these kind of things will inspire your creative process. So we want, that's of course a call that talks about a topic that we picked. What an amazing opportunity to talk about the future of mobility, given our location, the geography of this place, the fact that we're in Detroit, but just also thinking about a large, what this kind of work entails for the discipline. And that's kind of something I wanted to add on top of this, just to look at the response to our proposal. So for us, again, we have been nervous for a few months, but at least during the day of the deadline, we really started seeing the submissions coming in, and that made us aware of the fact that there's at least interest in this kind of work and in these kind of initiatives. And for us, of course, it was an opportunity to talk about the school as well and the things we're doing. And the legacy that we want to talk about as it relates to all these topics that we kind of mentioned now. So,
And that's, well, we're going to introduce the panel, but I also always forget to introduce us. So why don't you introduce yourself?
Sara Kodarin, assistant professor of architecture. That's it. Roboticist. I like AI. We've been playing with AI and curator of the exhibition. Have you introduced yourself?
No.
Please.
And I think the next slide is the panelist, right? So my name is Carl Dubman. I'm the Dean of the College of Architecture and Design. Welcome, everyone. And then we'll just have, in a different order, but how about we go like this and have each of you guys introduce yourselves. We wanted to open up the work to a broader discussion, and so I think you'll get a sense from the panelists here, a broad range of perspectives as it relates to that.
Hi. Hi, I'm Gretchen Wilkins. I head of the Master of Architecture program at Cranbrook Academy of Art, which is just up the road.
I'm Julian Bleeker, founder of the Near Future Laboratory.
I'm Melissa. I'm an assistant professor of practice at the University of Michigan. Brian's here.
And I'm Mike Canty. I'm a design manager at Lincoln and adjunct professor here in the industrial design department.
So we have broad expertise here in the panel. We're pretty excited about this. We've had a very brief prep session about what's the goal of this conversation. Should we talk about AI? Should we talk about the city? Should we talk about mobility? Our response was yes. So we'll see where this conversation is going. I would like to start showing just a few images, because kind of as a starting point for this conversation would be, you are the jurors, you looked at all the images that were submitted, and sort of we would like to start from there, like if there are, what inspired you? We know that you had some like preferred images that sort of you wanted to highlight in this sort of big group of submissions. And just to, as a starting point, we'll go through, we'll show some images that in this case Julian picked, and just going through them, the question for you is, what inspired you?
Yeah, so I was, maybe can you go back to the very first one? There, yeah. So I was, having played with Midjourney a lot and also I've become obsessed with using Midjourney to do images, to do vehicles of some sort. I was like kind of tuned into where I could see that someone was trying to push what the algorithm would do. Because the algorithm is sort of like, it's tuned to certain the expectations. I think we already have expectations. When you say vehicle, it's like all of a sudden 4 wheels, a chassis, becomes vehicle. And almost like intriguing and boring in some sense. We're repairing some kind of telecommunications network, a grid, or something of that sort. So that really appealed to me. And also it just kind of reminded me, the image on the right reminded me of like maybe waterways that you might see in Bangkok, kind of thing, like that, where you might see boats moving around in there. And then the one contrasted to one on the left, which felt like, oh, that might be just off of Williamsburg in Brooklyn. So there was something about that came through. It's Detroit. Oh, yes, of course, Detroit.
Almost vintage
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah, the Detroit, the Williamsburg of Michigan.
Yeah, no, I would like to actually riff off of what you were saying about the lack of preparation. I think that's what attracted to me to this notion of like being prepared as a design industry, because I think we spend a lot of time focusing on just designing products, and I'm coming from the automotive space, so I spend a lot of time designing products to make profit, to sort of drive a company forward into the future. But this sort of exposes the idea that maybe we're not spending enough time preparing for these futures in general. And it makes you think that maybe we do need, I mean, your book is titled Manual of Design Fiction, but maybe we need some sort of our role as designers are potentially to understand what these potential futures could be, and maybe we create a manual for a society that may not, when the lights go out, may not be prepared to know how to deal with it and still maintain some semblance of quality of life. I know we're very resourceful as a species, right? We could kind of MacGyver our way through it, I guess, but it would be better if we could be a little bit more prepared. And I don't know if there's any companies sort of focusing on that, but yeah, a manual for survival or something.
Can I add to that? Going off that a little bit more with the last slide, if we're talking about like, oh, we should think about these futures, looking at the maps that we saw of where all these images came from was really interesting to relate to sort of what's happening in these pictures, because when I was going through it, I was like, who is imagining these pictures? Are they Detroiters or are they in Italy, you know? And Detroit takes on such a mythic sort of feel. And so I was thinking as a design methodologist, what it would be to crowdsource different futures from different places and what that means to the notion of place itself, especially from an urban planning and architecture standpoint.
I would just add the thing about like kind of mundane, everyday quality of some of the images really struck me too. I think there's this kind of idea about a spectrum of how close we are to these sorts of questions and how far, like a kind of really far in the future vision. I know we're thinking 2050, which I thought, 27 years from now, I was thinking back to when my age, when that was, like when would that amount of time, like can I imagine that amount of time from my age, which I can, like it's some
30 years.
It's not that far in some ways, right? So I think that thing about like we're incrementally getting there, and that there was some that really struck me that were like not just inventing everything, that we have to adapt ourselves to this future that is kind of preceding us, but we're making that future, and there's a kind of like everydayness there, but the technology is kind of well advanced of that, or some combination of those sort of everyday and like incredibly futuristic seems more real in some ways than the whole world kind of changing within 23 years or 27 years.
Well, like to your point, we picked 2050, and for us was interesting because it's like it is in the future, so there's some sort of like speculative projection that needs to happen, but to a certain extent it's also credible. We feel that it's close enough so we can start picturing in our minds scenarios as it relates to that.
Well, I'll just add, we were talking about it before. Oh, it seems like an arbitrary, not far enough distance in the future, but just thinking about in the last year, what we've seen happen with AI, what we've seen happen in the last couple of years with a pandemic, it feels like projecting 200 years in the future just seems so foreign, and I think getting through this week seemed difficult enough, and so like 30 years out seemed like trying to find a balance between that and a nice kind of round number in terms of 2050.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you, can you go back to that one? So that the improbable, yeah, did you want to go over any more of your selections?
Yeah, not necessarily, but so this one there was something about the representation, I think that it was just not typical in terms of like the other kinds of ways of representing the vehicles. It's more illustrative, and there was just some appeal to it, and it had this character of I don't know, like 50s modernism or something that kind of what resonated with me mostly because it was like
hand done too.
Different from the other ones.
Yeah, actually, I think Dustin did a really good job. Actually, I think Dustin was obviously my favorite choice in regards to his approach, and it seems like a mastery of AI. It really looks like he didn't allow the tool to control the output, and he put in that mechanism somehow. I don't know how he did it, where it looks like a hand-done piece of art, and it looks human, right? And it actually exposes this idea of what is AI going to become for us in the future, and it's going to be easy to allow it to control our output. So I thought this was a really great example of how we can master the tool, and it also begs into question, what is the role of a designer in the future? Because if we let AI become the dominant source of inspiration, or actually dominant source of output, then I think it's a matter of how much influence does a designer have over that tool, and that begs the question: is what is the role of a designer in the future going to become? Because this is a real thing. This is, and I think AI is at its infancy right now. It's being taught how to create inspirational generative imagery, and we use that as designers, at least in the automotive space. We're using it as that tool mechanism, but it doesn't really have the other considerations built into its structure as of yet to replace a designer. I don't think that's going to be happening in our immediate future, because all of those different attributes of what it means to be a designer, like understanding of human factors, the psychology of people, their emotional response to designs, brand values, manufacturing feasibility. That's all stuff that we're still going to have to, as designers, maintain a position on. So
the other one that you brought up the other day was gravity.
Gravity, yeah. Yeah, well, we can go into those later. But yeah, there was you can tell that AI is still in its infancy, and it doesn't have a lot of considerations built into it. So I think to replace a designer in the future, I think there's a lot of conversations about whether or not that'll happen. I think AI actually has to have all of those attributes and considerations intentionally built into its architecture to replace a designer. And I don't think that's the case. But what it does turn us into is sort of curators of the designs, right? And we almost shift our role to a design direction, or making sure that whatever comes out of this is appropriate. So, yeah, please.
Can I just add to the other images too while we're there? The thing about process, I think, is really important in authorship within all of these images that we're seeing, and I think I was also struck by those drawings, as they're not trying to, like, so much of what we see is a kind of photorealistic kind of completed context within which the project sits, and you have to design the context. You have to at least consider the context and the automobile or the form of mobility, whatever it is, the product at the same time, where those drawings are trying to, I feel like they're more trying to, like, leaving gaps in that story for you to fill in, and because they're kind of, they almost remind me a little bit of like a Beaux-Arts analytique drawing, right? Where it's like plan, section, perspective, and everything is kind of like telling you the three-dimensionality of it, but not in a single shot, but in a way that you have to kind of do a little bit of work and sort of interpretation to get at, which anyone in the room or anyone looking at it might come up with a different kind of narrative for that, or understanding of that, which I thought was really interesting for AI, because it's not telling you, it's not kind of completing it for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
To give us a little bit of urgency, so I was having this conversation with someone around how the role of the designer varies so much depending on what you're even designing. So when we talk about this question of, like, what is the role of the designer in the future, is like, which designer is it? Right. And when we start looking at these tools and we're looking at the output and we're projecting sort of our fears into what we see about how it can substitute the things that we can do, like, I personally build tools, so I build like machine learning platforms and manufacturing operations platforms, so I build tools that build things. And that's very different from building like the thing itself. And I know definitely in practice that architects are being employed within companies to tag drawings, for example, which in many ways is being, is taking your professional practice or your professional knowledge and now baking that into a tool. And so I'm a little worried that this obsession with the rendering itself is kind of a waste of time. Like, we should kind of think a little bit more critically about the job that we want, instead of, projecting ourselves and our worries into this. So more optimism, I guess.
So listen, that was like spot on, because I think if you're designing the tools that build the things, I think there might be a little bit more of a gap between where the inspiration came from for the original intention of the design to begin with. So both designers, looking at it from completely other end of the spectrum, my role would be more inspiration, like defining the values, like understanding the customer way up front, building like the artistic vision, and then seeing it through production. So we need that inspiration, and we need that ambiguity sometimes. We need that artistry, that human touch. So that's why I love these, because they inspire, and that's what designers need at that point and stage in the project or in the product. Julian mentioned it too, but I was definitely attracted to the idea of potentially being unprepared for the future. It had like a DIY sort of quality to it. It contrasted pretty heavily with the more sort of overly futured, like whimsical, like floating spaceships, right? But this brought it back down to that human quality, and it made me think that we can democratize design. It's not just about being a designer. People can do it. It feels like people will manage when they need to. But like I said before, I think maybe it should be part of our role to prepare the human species for an outcome potentially like this. And what else I picked up on too, and I think you mentioned this, Julian, is even though it feels like it might be apocalyptic, it still feels human and bright, and it feels like optimistic, actually, that we can get through it. And that's the message and undertone that I'm extracting from this.
I think that those are the elements that are valuable about these hyper-realistic images. I really like the conversation about the drawings and what does it mean for us to abstract certain information and trying to rebuild the three-dimensionality of these things. But and there's, I feel sometimes a misunderstanding about, like, related to the things that we are seeing. So those are sketches, but they look like renderings, right? So it's like start thinking about those things in that sense. But they do capture the things you're talking about, the feelings, like an aspect of like how life will look like in a few decades, and like all sort of like kind of human aspects that I think that can inspire this kind of conversation too. So
these images I identify way more with. As a matter of fact, I think I would rather be in this world than the Mercedes concept car world. To be honest, I can't identify with it.
And that leads us to this set of images.
Yeah, so I don't want that.
So the reason I chose these is because, like, I'm a car designer. I work at Lincoln. I've been at Ford for about 11 years, and we're currently using AI tools more in this spectrum, where it's sort of we want an output where it inspires our future brand vision, right? It pushes the boundaries of manufacturing. It gives us a position where we might want to explore, and we're using it as an inspirational tool. So I would extract certain things out of images like this if they were hung on the wall, like obviously the commitment to transparency, like looking at elevated volumes perhaps, obviously the growth, the natural, bringing nature into the interior space, huge takeaway from this. So I guess my point is that I would use this as an inspirational tool to help drive our future product. And this is how we would be using AI mostly in the automotive sector, at least currently. So
there's so many images, I think, that showed some combination. I don't know I'm curious. We were talking about what the inputs were. It'd be interesting to see what were the words that went into these. But so many images that showed some combination of an automobile or some kind of vehicular mobility with landscape or like plants, right? And like a kind of moving
it's a huge
terrarium.
trend.
Yeah, yeah.
Organic infused into mobility.
And not just by one or two people, right? But by so many people thinking about. So maybe it was a direct, like very explicit input, or maybe it was some combination that produced that. But I found it to be, if you look around the room, yeah, a really consistent trend about something. And I think I was thinking about it more into, like you said, in sort of inspiration, more in terms of a kind of like atmospheric effect, or whether it's like fuel or something. It seems more interesting when it's not just that literal kind of layering of one thing onto the other, but some other way of thinking about how you're bringing those things together as you move through a space.
I think it would have been super valuable if we could record their inputs as far as their prompts.
We joke that if we do this again next year, we're not asking for images, we'll only ask for the prompts.
Yeah, prompts only, please.
But for people that maybe haven't used this tool before, one of the things that stands out to me in particular with these images is that before AI, if you wanted to do a rendering, you had to model everything that was in the view, and then you had to render it and have the light there. And I think there's just as a result, renderings for many years lacked a certain amount of detail, and maybe not even detail
It's a time commitment.
the fidelity of the thing, but even the background. So like for me, the candle in the foreground is probably an unintended, I'm sure it wasn't part of the prompt, but like, oh, that adds a sense of what's happening in the space,
The
right? Or
essence and the feeling.
is there a smell or a scent because of the plants that are there? And these other types of details, I think, were always absent from things that we did previously, and it feels like there is more either realism or life that starts to find its way into renderings now.
And ironically,
Whimsy.
you said that, but back in design school, I used to put stuff in there, and my instructor told me it was a distraction. Yeah. So this is great to see that it sets mood and context. So I agree with you.
Can Lincoln be inspired beyond exclusivity and
I hope so.
so I wonder why images like this. I'm just trying to figure out why they rub me the wrong way, because it doesn't seem like a future that is either plausible or that is going to address the concern that you had earlier about preparing, or I don't know.
Yeah, no, I see where you're going with it, and I think I agree with you. I wouldn't buy one myself, but it's only because like I prefer a little bit more human and inviting others to be around. But yeah, but yeah, exactly. But I think luxury is one of those topics that's worth a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
And the perception of exclusivity, and that word bothers me as well. Exclusivity, because I think luxury should be something that's more accessible. So I agree with you. But I was just selecting these images just to demonstrate how we would potentially apply AI internally in our design studios. So.
Yeah, so I think we can take a look at some more images. So
I have the most images because I love diversity. So to your point, I mostly think of things in terms of systems, in part because I have a disability. So I'm always thinking about maintenance. I'm thinking about redundancy. So whenever I'm looking at these images, I'm like, how do they charge? How do we fix them? Like, who builds them? Can we even build them?
Huh?
Who are they for? So most of my images are kind of a little bit more punk rocky, which is an interesting sort of like stylistic choice in itself. But on the left or right or whatever, you can see that there's like a person who's fixing a car. I think that might have been the only image of a repair person fixing this, which is so antithetical to actually how autonomous vehicles are being produced today with like Tesla. Like that's a closed loop system. This is an open loop future. That's very, I don't know. If that's the future we want, we have a lot of work to do, like this. That image was also interesting from a disability standpoint because it feels like it's a wheelchair, but it's not quite a wheelchair. And I really like this idea that we have a little bit more of a universality, for lack of better words, for like mobility itself. Like maybe when we're traveling in this future, people who have mobility issues are a little bit more integrated into the environment. And that's a really exciting type of future. Yeah, so going on with this sort of mushing of different ways different people move, and also trans-scalar, sort of how scale in some of these images get conflated. So on that one that looks like a hotel, it's like a car and a hotel at the same time. I think that the way that we think of scale in this future, in a mobile future, where a car is no longer a car, but can also be a place where you live, and actually we're just like in caravans is really interesting. But then it's like, why is it a hotel or a house? Like the program itself hasn't changed. And as like a person who loves theory, I just am like, why can't we do something more interesting in this day rather than just sleeping and living in it? And then that makes me think like the machine learning model is like learning off of the present day, right? So it doesn't have sort of like an understanding of how programmatically space itself would be used differently. But if we're aware of like how machine learning models are made, then we can see that that's actually a gap, even though it's like incredibly rendered in like high fidelity. The one on the right is also sort of talking to this question of energy. That one in particular, I thought, did the idea that you could, grow your own energy to power this car really well for some reason. It kind of looks like a tree. And the lamps inside reflect the tree things outside. And so I think visually the car was really compelling, or whatever it is.
Carriage, looks like a carriage.
Carriage. Yeah. Next. Okay,
We
I got
compare
made
this
fun
with
of for
any
this.
other images, so take it away.
I love
I
this.
knew this was your choice. This is,
I love this image so much because when we think of using this tool, all of these images are expressing a far future. But this image in particular is expressing to me a near future because the categories are so clear. Like there's a chicken and there's a motorcycle. And it's ridiculous. And that makes you think, like, how would you even build that, you know? And you're automatically prompted to think of process. And I thought it was brilliant, and I'm sure, like, maybe the person was trying to be ridiculous, but I thought I was inspired, so. Yeah, so this is like different forms of mobility. We have like Amazon's future with pipes, delivery boxes perhaps, and we don't have to move, the packages come to us, but then there's also like a walkway down the middle and people are walking, and I thought that was like an interesting way to think about mobility. And then like mobility on the sea was also really surprising, especially with all of those sails. I was like, how does wind work in this future? I was just a little confused, but like, do they all control, like, why would you even need that? Like, the ocean is so big. I don't know, so.
I do want to comment though on like, I think this is a product of AI, just the scale of things rather than like, if I was to start a project, I would just, if I thought about something at that scale, I might lock up and freeze up, right? Because there's just so much involved in considering who's using it, what is it used for, what is it, the form factor, how is it built. But I think AI has the freedom to explore beyond what humans would allow themselves to. So you get the scaling, which is like unbelievable, physics aside, right? So I just wanted to mention that and how much opportunity that opens up for designers and look at things in a larger format. So.
I think too the image, I don't know if it's your left or right, but the one of the interior of the city, I was interested too because of this, again, this thing that like we're not starting from scratch, we're starting from now. And we're building into this future. And so the idea, there was this one, which I thought was great, and other versions of it, and some other examples of this where it was adaptations and tweaks and kind of incremental additions onto existing buildings that were built, maybe 50 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, that we're kind of adapting something about, and also the kind of verticality, like how do you think about not just mobility as moving through horizontal space in cars, but like other systems within the city that need mobility. Relative to increased density or Amazon deliveries or whatever it might be, but I think there's a kind of, just that kind of mixing of thinking about it as a question that we're reflecting on. It reflects as much on where we are now as it does where we're going.
I picked a tube one as well. I thought of more of like a habit trail, like that people actually moved through those.
I thought of that, but I was like, how, that hurts.
Well, they're not sucked through the vacuum. It's not like Mario. It's like
The hamster sort of cage.
Yeah.
But Elisa, you did mention something about like looking at these images, they sort of start open up room for a conversation about making things and like how we could manufacture in the future. So I thought you just mentioned this aspect that I think is interesting. So if you guys want to share some thoughts about that, like just like being exposed to all these kind of forms and ideas, and I know that many of those kind of artifacts look shiny and blobby. So there's some sort of like something that is being informed by a desire of seeing this kind of aesthetics. But even in terms of how those things could come together in the future, can be assembled, like is there a social aspect related to that? If you have any observations related
As far as the manufacturing of things?
Yes.
And how AI will influence that?
Or how just like...
I think there's definitely potential, and because so for, at least from my experience, designing cars, it's a 5-year process from first sketch to it hitting the road. That's a huge investment of time and money. And there's all the nuances of the manufacturing process. So the sketch phase to the theme selection, clay model, final delivered design is a much shorter process than it is to actually build it and phase everything out, right? So I think there's two different things. AI can help designers ideate and generate inspirational ideation, but it could also be applied to the engineering and to the manufacturing world, because there's an entire book of rules, design rules, how certain parts are connected, how they're supposed to be attached, thicknesses, draft angles. All of that stuff could be sort of automated, I think, and it could help get us out of the dredge and the daily grind of every single one of those things considered, and it could probably shorten down the time exponentially for manufacturing. So yeah, that's a huge financial benefit, I think, for the company.
What about the, so we've been talking about AI generating these images, but what about AI being used within the car itself to drive it? Like, how does that work at where you work?
I'm not involved in that, but there are a lot of conversations about predictive AI, and I think I was having a conversation in the medical field about it, how it could be used to predict, different sort of ailments and help you prevent things. But as far as driving, I'm not familiar enough with what they're using, but I think it's definitely going to be a space to watch.
Well, to Sarah's point, like if we're thinking about like disasters and climate change, like AI is kind of necessary to that future and managing it. And right now, when we're working, because I was involved in a very large team building a cyber physical sort of like system where we took data off of our IoT devices being used on the shop floor to do whatever the shop floor needed to do. But that interface between the physical and the digital is really hard to crack from a systems perspective. And that's probably the biggest blocker to getting AI off the ground in the first place. Because when we look at it in terms of design culture, there's this long history of designing cars. Then you have a really short history of actually big data and using it and understanding how to design big data systems. So now you have wanting to integrate big data systems with these designers who are used to working in very particular ways. So digitization is not just a technical issue, but a cultural issue as well. So I'm just we've been talking about autonomous vehicles for so long. Where are they? You know what I mean? Where are these cars? So it's not even just a process of building the car itself. It's just who is trying to do this and why are they failing? I don't feel like we ever talk about that enough.
Yeah. Like I said, I wish I knew, but I think that's the thing about AI too, is it changes the expectation for our future, for our entire species. What you're pointing out now was interesting, because what you're saying is, I've already expected it to be here. Why isn't it already here? When 10 years ago, they were saying, how are we going to even get there at all? So I think as long as the expectation of people is still there, it's going to drive progress. So I'm glad that you believe that. And I think that this will actually accelerate us, so that way people feel more comfortable with automation because it's more integrated into their everyday lives. But most of it is investment cost, to be honest, but that's a different conversation.
I mean, you just used the word accelerate. I asked Sarah to go back to these images because I think there's also an aspect of some of what we've seen that seems incredibly slow and maybe also incredibly quiet. And so for me, some of the images evoke certain qualities that maybe we don't typically associate with mobility, right? That the hotel module might take a week to get you from one place to the next, or that's a carriage on the left and it might be quiet, and I'm curious, as it's generating its power and its steam, is there a scent associated with it, or does it make particular sound as it goes by? And so I think these are maybe some of the things that the evocativeness of the image might challenge us to then, I don't know, we've been talking about imagine harder over this workshop today with Julian, and I think the question, like, why is it still a hotel? Why does it look like this? Right? But those moments that maybe challenge us to push things a little bit further and to maybe be invested in that as a vision for something, right? The thought of producing all of these images, oh, maybe there's something worth exploring in some way, or how as a designer do I pick up this, start with this simple image and really invest in it and research in it and try and develop the next stage of that beyond just a simple image.
But do you think that the designer's job is to just render the vision, or do you think that there also is an ethical commitment to building it?
Oh yeah, both. It's both. Well, the unfortunate reality, at least in the past, is that the most beautiful imagery is what gets the attention and gets selected. It's a very shallow approach. I admit that. But for a meaningful or useful design, right, that's more of how the user is impacted by it and how it affects their lives. And it's all those things that could easily get disguised under a beautiful image, that you could be missing opportunities there. So, we owe our users a compelling, useful design.
Or a built design. I want to see it built.
Yeah, well, it has to be built after you can identify that it's useful, right?
But I think there's also, I agree with that, but I think there's also a usefulness of images in and of themselves. Like, I think the thing about envisioning something, like, you have to, it puts the kind of the product before the process in a way that is recursive or generative, like, possibly, right? Like, instead of this idea that, like, you research something and then you imagine it and then you build it, sometimes you have to imagine it first in order to kind of come back to understand what that thing is. And that's what AI is interesting for, because it allows you to kind of imagine things that maybe you wouldn't have kind of gotten there in a linear way or in a procedural way. And so you see that, and then it might be inspirational in ways that could have 10 different potential outcomes, which I think is really interesting. So I think it's kind of a bit of both, maybe, personally.
Yeah, actually, from teaching here, sometimes I see some of my students tighten up when they have too much information, and then their outcome gets a little bit mechanical and just it lacks the inspiration because they get too bogged down in the realism or the. So you're absolutely right. You need to allow freedom for that inspiration flow.
I think there's also, just thinking about, there's an aspect of this work that, when we think about like when we say product designer, like there's like, oh, I know what that is. But there's also a way of thinking about the product part being not the commodity that we normally think of right away, but like the result of a dream that someone has represented in an image, the result of like an ambition or a desire. And so when we go the carriage and the hotel, just riffing off what you said, like that the way you described it, it's like it seems like a compelling dream that's not like off a track. It's just a different vision of what could be when it comes to movement. Or I mean, I love the idea when I see the hotel one. I think it's like, man, that'd be an awesome train scale trip. I'm going to take 36 hours or 3 weeks to go across Europe or North America or whatever it is. And that might, that's where I go. And it just changes the nature of what transportation or mobility might be. In the same way, they're different, like, so the train is, yeah, if you want a nice slow trip, that's how it's always presented, like and you have your own berth, and you have your own, the experience, like, oh, I'm going to finish this book finally, I'm just going to relax, I'm going to look at the view, I'm going to wander around and perambulate, as opposed to, just the other modes of transportation.
Yeah, because we're used to, as like a society, going to work, and then, right, you're driving, and we separate those, and living. We put boundaries in between those spaces. But what if you were always moving as you were living? So I really liked what you said about how slow can you move, right? So it's actually a really inspirational thing. I'm going to use that in the future.
I can segue into things I was interested in too, because I think it takes the question away maybe from efficiencies and practicalities and logistics and into maybe other value systems, like the other things that we value about time or space or a sensorial experience or things that can get integrated, which I think is super interesting. And so the segue, I guess, is that the images, it was really hard to choose, there's so many, but I was really struck by this image of the guy floating on the chair more than most other images, and in some ways it's not, in terms of like a technological revolution, it's not as maybe ambitious or futuristic as some of the others, but it goes to the core question which Elisa mentioned, which is like personal mobility, that we're the potential to unlock a whole series of spaces around our world that are currently inaccessible, and not just, certainly in a kind of universal design way, but also just in a completely different experiential way. And then it kind of comes back to like, how do you move through space? And I was thinking too that I lived here for some number of years. I left for 10 years and I came back, and during that 10 years I didn't have a car, and my whole previous life I loved driving, and I had a car since I was 16, and I got back and it was like, oh right, I'm back in this world where the only way you can get around is in this car, and you have to get a car, and you have to, in some places it's actually just it's a kind of seamlessly interesting, easy way of moving without that individualized, shell around you. So that image just for me unlocked, the one of the guy just unlocked so many things about like what is personal mobility, and how does that then scale out to other spaces that are accessible for kind of individuals, but now thinking about it as a collective, and what might that look like, not just for the thing itself, like the chair, but for the world around it. Like I found myself too asking that question of the images kind of key into, like, I'm interested in the image, but I'm also interested in the implications that they have at a bigger scale. Like if this is a reality, then what does that mean for cities, or what does that mean for suburbs, or what does that mean for buildings? So this, a theme here about the kind of verticality, that if these are potential futures of thinking about, like, you can move anything around, whether it's the birth of a train or a library or kind of multifamily housing, then the world around that would change somehow, right? Because you could bring the library to the side of a building, and people could from the 5th floor just like go onto the library. It's not so much that it's an autonomous thing, but that it connects in kind of integral and maybe systematic ways with the world around it, which I thought was interesting about these. And then similar themes to before about like the kind of amphibious world, potential world that we may be facing, and how we kind of integrate architecture, urbanism, vehicles, space, personal space in kind of something that seems comfortable, and we feel comfortable in a kind of space where we typically are separating all of those things out, both spatially and in terms of how we move around the world. So that was equally interesting for me. And then the idea that drones could scale up and be not just there was a few versions of some of these, and for me it wasn't the ones that felt like a kind of Disney ride as much as the ones that felt like it was just an everyday way of getting to work that I thought was kind of interesting, because if they can if they can move around the world in their way, why can't they take a few hundred pounds with them?
So it's a practicality that was.
Yeah, I think I kept
layer?
coming back to that, like that there's a kind of, as imaginative and futuristic as these ideas might be, there's also something kind of like it's integrated in our normal life.
It's funny because so my old mentor at my design school I went to, he always used to say it, keep about 20% outside of the box, because if you go too far, you start to lose people's interest. It's probably like just from a little bit of a lack of understanding. So I like how you reached, but then you brought it. I think it's a natural instinct of just as a person to understand what you're looking at. And when it gets too far, maybe we start to reject it a little bit. But I think what AI is forcing us to do is get almost immersed in and it expands those boundaries a little bit. So.
You can still see yourself in it somehow.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's to the point earlier that I was thinking about, where some of the images too required us as human bodies to transform in order to become part of the world that was being imagined, which is always interesting. But it's, I think, another way of thinking about it is that like those things are adapting because we're developing them incrementally. So maybe the things that we don't need to put on like a whole suit, but we can just kind of like get inside the drone. I don't know. It's like it's kind of closer to us at the moment. And then I guess the image of the one Rolando, I think that was kind of almost the opposite spectrum for me. It's still a personal scale, but I was thinking about like if we're going to make these things that are delivering things other like Amazon, back to Amazon, like products, the idea that there's something mobile that doesn't have a directionality. This isn't maybe exactly that, but it doesn't have a directionality that we're so used to moving in kind of forward, backward, left, right in these Cartesian ways. And so our vehicles are things that we drive relate to that. There's a front, there's a back, but it seems like that may not matter as much. It's like we have a 360-degree sphere of movement, and the things that we're designing might relate to that. I don't know, I'll ask you.
I want to interject. The one on the right there at the bus, this showcases, I think, the naivety of physics for AI. I guess it's inspirational right, but you need some serious suspension innovation to hold, right? I mean, it's inspiring, but yeah, there's a level of physics that's not baked into to its consideration.
Yeah, the bus, the one that's the bus, I thought, again, bus and the ship really was
Ship
sort of...
looks more feasible, maybe because the wheels are hidden, I don't know, but...
The ship just, I thought, like, is this a real future where we're trying to find use for ships that, we're not, like, who wants to go on a cruise anymore? And yet there's this huge, giant building of an object that we've made. They're huge, right? And they have so much infrastructure already built into it. So how... I just thought it was kind of genius, actually, that those things now kind of get somehow integrated into an urban system.
Like dry docked and become apartment blocks or something.
Okay.
I guess I need a mic for this. Oh, that's loud. So since we have received kind of like a considerable amount of work, and all these images were pretty incredible, and we had amazing conversations related to the work that we are seeing here in this show and this exhibition, we thought it was worth it to sort of assign recognition for a few of the authors that are represented here in the show. So with the jurors that have done an amazing work selecting and going through all the images, and as you have noticed tonight, and also like articulating pretty like amazing thoughts about like how this work resonates with all the disciplines. I'm getting to the point. How about this? So you're looking at me like we need to wrap up.
You're trying to build suspense.
I'm a little bit. No. So we do have some honorable mentions and some sort of like top jury selection awards. So since we had an international call, we call them AI artists, dreamers, and what was the other term? There were a bunch of dreamers that submitted work. they're not here tonight, so maybe we can, when I announce their names, we can just do a round of applauses so that at least they have that on the live stream. So as a first...
And we are live streaming, and I think many of the people that submitted tonight are present on YouTube as well.
So we do want to clap for Doug Lake, and I think we... So congratulations, Doug. I think we have talked about like things that inspired.
We've seen some of, well, I guess the panelists picked some of the images. These are then pulled from that. So we've talked about Doug's work, but without, I guess we had his name there, but congratulations to Doug Lake for submitting a number of projects that both we talked about as the curators and the panelists talked about.
Next in line. And do have Greg Tate, so let's do that. Awkward. Should I say anything? We have just had a conversation about like those two realms of imagery. So congratulations, Greg. Thanks for those amazing submissions and for enabling us to kind of initiate this discussion. There's no way I can pronounce this name, so we'll just say. Hopefully we'll reach out asking.
I'd say it's interesting that it's the same person. I think we saw that in a number of instances that people submitted kind of radically different and diverse work.
We'll reach out for clarifications about what those pipes are for.
I do want to mention though, like it's interesting to see how their unique personalities come through with so it's not all just, look at that. I mean, these are distinctly them, even though AI was involved. So I do want to mention that. So let's try to maintain our human expression through our work.
Jury awards. So we have agreed on the following AI artists to receive recognition for their work, starting from Dustin White. Just beautiful representation, human presence of like pretty intensive and beautiful human presence in these kind of iterations.
He submitted a lot of other things too that weren't just drawings, and so there's again a range of
ideas.
Diversity of ideas and representation techniques.
And next, Jared Rice, that allow us to think about scenarios we should keep in mind. And hopefully last but not least, Odden Ertug. That was exciting. Do we have, well, should we pause to see if there are any questions from the audience?
I think we have a couple minutes. We're just about at an hour, so I want to be mindful and also give people a chance to look around the room too, but we're happy to take some questions if there's any questions. And you were going to have a question if there wasn't questions. And we could also look online if there's questions.
Yeah, I'm going there to check that out.
Yeah.
My question is for Professor Michael. So you talked about AI as an inspirational tool. So I wanted to know, how do you apply AI to get the right starting points for your designs?
Sorry, can you say that last bit again? I couldn't hear.
How do you use AI to get your starting points for your designs? As you mentioned, using AI as an inspirational tool.
Right. No, it's a good question. I think every designer has their own approach. Now, internally at Ford, we're just adopting it, I think. It's been around for not too long. So we're still trying to figure out the best way to integrate it into our process. But generally, we're using it from just like a rough sketch, right? Rough sketch, bring it in, and we're using it as a render tool. just to save time for rendering. There's a scalability of how much influence you want to let the AI have over dictating your design. So that's an adjustment scale of 0 to 100. So yeah, you can get some really quick propositions out of it if you just let the AI take a little bit more control. And then once you see something you're interested in, you capture that, and now you set your refinement to right, let the drawing influence dictate the next round of ideation. But that's just in a render format. As far as like integrating it into the design process, it's still being learned. Like it's prompt-based design at this point, which is the challenge, because at least Viscom is what we use, and there's some security stuff that the company has to prevent, like security leaks, data leaks and such. So I think the library that we use, I think, is a little bit more restrictive than what something like that has access to the full internet. So the outcomes are a little bit, like I want to say more generic, but we're improving that. And the prompts, I think, are a little bit more literal. So if I wanted to say, you know, for Lincoln, we want it to be more human and less exclusive, then if I put in the word human, it's not going to abstract what I'm looking for as far as like relatable or the psychology of being human. What it's going to do is it's probably going to put some hands and feet in the image. Right? I have had that happen where it stretches. So I think the prompting is still a little bit literal, and that's why I'm looking at it more of a render time saver tool right now. But as soon as our data set is expanded, then we can actually get a little bit more like valuable internal collaboration with it. So did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Can always count on you.
So I have two questions. So I noticed from your map that you've got submissions from all over the world. Does the system translate language into English? So if I'm speaking Chinese into it, and there's a certain word that doesn't translate directly as English, does that have an effect on the imagery that it's going to generate? Then my second question is somewhat related. Did you notice as jurors any kind of, I don't know about if difference is the right word, or regionality, identifiers, like people from, I noticed nobody from India was selected, but let's say Iceland versus San Antonio. Did the imagery change based on location?
I mean, speaking for myself, I didn't actually look into any regionalisms, but I just looked at the images at face value and sort of, so yeah, it would be interesting to actually record that.
I don't think we gave the jurors, well, no names, I don't think any locations, anything like that. But I can say from running a couple of workshops, we had a Saudi student using a different language, and the images, it produced very different images. And so I think it does, you can use you can use non-English as a way to prompt it. And I think as a result, it taps into a different database. Imagine a Google image search and what you would search for, and the way that would be different.
I think it's a really interesting question, though. I've thought this before, you know, in different ways about this whole process, like, because there's this interesting quote between John Berger and John Christie about the word blue, and they talk about, like, if you translate the word blue through every language of the word, what will you end up with? You know, because at every point you're changing its meaning, and so how you might, as a multilingual architect, artist, designer, you know, test that theory, it could be really interesting just to think about, even in one language, like the different connotations of the word. You choose one word, but then you have different connotations and test. It's a really fascinating way of thinking about the proposition of imagery and meaning and content through that initial prompt.
I mean, even from like some languages, you'll have multiple words, right? That describe or you even have one word that describes multiple things, and it's contextual. And just like that notion in itself, and how you develop from a child all the way to an adult with this like understanding that you have to understand context. Like some languages will actually create, I don't want to say more creative people, but more people that are more sensitive to context because of that. So it's an interesting question, because it's like, how would AI actually evolve into that same spectrum? So
It's really hard for context to be used in AI, just because of how object recognition works. So I know too much about it, and so I'm trying to think about it mechanically, and I just feel like you would have to describe like a vibe, some type of style, or like more specific, like what kind of you would have to describe the background more specifically than to say like, hey, I want Tokyo. Maybe Tokyo would work because there's a lot of pictures of Tokyo, for example. But if you're asking for a place that doesn't have quite so much data, like let's say Mongolia or something, like I don't predict that it would be able to give you Mongolia, which is a really interesting research question. Unrelated to the images itself, there is a study done on like, let's say, like the translation of Buddhism as a concept across different data sets in different languages, and there are definite biases there. So that's where I'm saying like the AI or machine learning as a process, it leaves out a lot of what we understand to be meaningful as humans and is very literal. And so when you're working with these image generators, the more precise that you can be is actually like, I mean, you probably have more experience with it than I do, but like the more precise that you can be in the shot that you're using, or what you want as a background color, or like what you want, the form that you want, that is how you can get the best kind of rendering. Which is interesting when you look at it from like an education point of view, because at that point, if you have like an art history background, for example, and you have looked at a lot of images and you can like call out a particular artistic style or something like this, then you can manipulate the images a lot more easily, which makes us think like what happened then to the knowledge base for things like art or things like transportation.
yeah, I mean that's a huge topic, but like, I mean, it's a generational gap too. I think we're gonna end up seeing it. Like we already had a generational gap between like the older mentality of sketch by hand has to be hand sketch. Then Photoshop came around, and all of a sudden it was a cheat. 3D modeling came around, and it was another cheat. And like the previous generations look at it like, oh, they're not learning the techniques that I learned. Now, as an educator and an active designer, now I'm coming to this point in my career that I have to decide, do I embrace it and teach it, or do I still, and in parallel, teach the older way of thinking? And I have to find that bridge between appropriateness and authorship and, right, and personal creativity. So
I think you definitely always have to dive into the tool, but I'm wondering, like, would it be more interesting, or like, could we change the process by actually creating a dictionary or something like this, or a glossary of our own? You know what I mean? That would be so that you can have the words. Because sometimes when I'm using it, I'm like, how do I describe this thing?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that I want to close on and give people a chance to talk about it. I think someone who's been personally using this and having the data, I've generated in a little over a year more than 30,000 images. And that's when we talk about design as being able to, the way that we iterate, the way that we prototype, the way that we test things, both it gives us an immense ability with a hope for maybe quality that comes from that quantity that gets produced. But I think what we also really wanted to show here with 500 images in the show is that on one hand, maybe an inexpensiveness of the production of the image, where in the past, if these were all Photoshop, if they were all modeled and then rendered, that would be a completely different undertaking. And so I think
It's like
the ability,
millions of hours.
yeah, exactly. And there's still time, there's still intent, there's still thought that's put into all of these things, but the ease with which we can produce a photoreal image now and put it into the world, I think is going to cause us as educators to think about this. LTU this past week as the university held a university-wide symposium on AI and how we are finding that within teaching, how we see it happening in research and other types of areas too. And so I think it feels like we're just at the start of this, and we're going to be grappling with it as it relates to professional design careers, as it relates to how we teach these things and other things to come. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I want to thank the jurors for joining us and sharing your thoughts on all of this. Thank you very much.
And thanks to all the students and all the people around that submitted. It was really fantastic to see all this. It was pretty incredible. So.